Hey everyone, welcome back to the Trendcrusher podcast. I'm Peter K, aka Trendcrusher. This episode is a big one. I got a chance to speak to Dan Lilker, a man that needs no introduction to any metalhead. The man has literally played in bands that have defined subgenres of metal. But before we get into that episode, I'd like to play a track from a band from Nepal. They're part of this entire movement that calls themselves Kathmandu Valley Hardcore. They're called Six Coffins, old school hardcore, metallic hardcore, call it what you want. Here's the track from their demo, First Nail, Six Coffins.
They rise from the coffins. Waking up dead, there is one. Free with light, different light. That I nothing, that I lie. Fuck the dead, the sunlight. Walking dead, to the sick. Nothing here, nothing right. That I nothing, that I lie. Fuck the dead, the sunlight. Walking dead, to the sick. Nothing here, the fucking dead. The false light, the deadness, the second light, the fucking sweetness, the black light, the deadness, the second light, fucking sweetness. In the desert, sentences. In the dirt, gonna turn. The coming storm, the false light. The defense, the second light, fucking witness. One hand is gone, you're strong. And one hand is gone, you're strong. This, the this, you're done, it's done. This, the this, you're done.
And that was Six Coffins all the way from Nepal. Do check out the First Nail. They've got merch. I believe they've got even CDs and cassettes. I'm going to leave the link in the show notes. Do check them out and support them. And now for the episode, I've got Dan Lilker and Dave Hofer. Dave Hofer wrote the book Perpetual Conversion, 30 Years and Counting in the Life of Metal Veteran Dan Lilker. We had a chat about the book. The second edition was recently launched, and a lot more. Here's my chat with them. Okay, it's not too often I'm up this early in the morning here in India, but you know what? You get opportunities like this very few, so why not? And I'm fortunate enough to be joined by two gentlemen. One who I think the easiest way to describe you is a metal lifer. Is that fair, Dan?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. Like 40 years in, definitely.
Yeah, and that was the voice of Dan Lilker. If you don't already know, and I'm pretty sure at least you've heard one of his bands, if not multiple. And we're also joined by Dave Hofer. How's it going, man?
Good, thank you.
Yeah, so again, the reason why we're talking is there's the second edition of the book, Perpetual Conversion, 30 Years and Counting in the Life of Metal Veteran Dan Lilker. So let's start off with, I think, the very basic, right? And I know it's been 10 years since the book released, but as we were discussing before we hit record, there's probably a new generation, a new kind of metal fan that's discovering the book again. So Dan, when you first heard thing that there's going to be a book written about you, what was your initial reaction?
Well, I mean, I guess I was flattered that I've done enough stuff that it would justify a book. But it's really that, that Dave and I discussed this because um, Dave originally, when we met, was selling merch for Brutal Truth on a UK tour in 2007. And then he came out again the next year for a longer European tour. And then we just discussed the idea eventually about doing a book because I would always tell lots of funny stories. You could have a long drive and a day off in Spain or sitting around backstage with 6 hours until you go on. So I would fill the void with, amusing stories. And somebody said, you should write a book. And I'm like, fuck no, I'm too lazy. And Dave was like, I'll give it a shot. And so it was pretty much, it wasn't like somebody out of the blue said, I would like to do a book about you. It was Dave came up with the idea on the spot, and I knew him already. And I knew that he'd been, a journalist, but, not a long form journalist like the book ended up being. But I don't know. That's pretty much how it came. But yes, I was like, I guess, yeah, I guess I was flattered or embarrassed. But I mean, it's cool. It's the kind of thing I was able to show my mother, those kind of things. So it was cool.
And yeah, now turn it over to you, Dave. I mean, again, like Dan mentioned, right? One of the things is, hey, why write a book? And especially like the relationship that you all shared, that you all kind of knew each other, right? Because I think having read the book and I was revisiting it in preparation of this, what's cool about it, I feel, is just the candid nature, right? So, how did you kind of feel to translate that into something like a book? And tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, I mostly had done, shorter form question and answer style interviews, or just very short third person pieces about bands or artists or whatever. I did not feel confident in trying to put a book together and making it like a straight biography. I just didn't, I just don't have that training or that background. Um, I started writing in magazines and I grew up in punk and reading zines and just kind of had the idea to make it, it's a biography of him, but also like in kind of like a zine format, with like the two columns per page and all the pictures throughout. And that was just kind of like the loose idea. But then when we started talking and doing interviews, and especially when I started transcribing the interviews, it just became very evident that Danny's just, his cadence and just like his way of speaking and his sense of humor, it just felt like, it would be stupid to not kind of tell the majority of the narrative like from his perspective because he was very eloquent, and funny, like I said. And yeah, I just thought it would be a waste to try and, oh, let's like write a straight biography and then just pick out like some choice quotes here and there. It was like every quote was a choice quote, so yeah, it just kind of developed that way naturally. And I also kind of wanted it to be something you can just sort of pick up and open to a page and just, not be lost immediately. And just to have that kind of familiar, like fanzine sort of vibe.
Yeah, and I'm glad you kind of mentioned that, right? Because if you look at the book, and I have unfortunately the digital copy of it, but you can exactly do that. There's something that you kind of discover. And also, what was interesting for me was I was like, wait, there's this aspect also that you don't know. So going back to you, Dan, while you were doing these conversations and while the book released, you've been in metal for 30 years. What was there something that kind of you stood out for you where you were like, wait, this also happened, or something kind of new came up that you were kind of surprised about?
Oh, yeah, yes. Things like that did happen because in the course of making the book, we used a lot of stuff to jog my memory. I was very good about saving tour posters and tour books and laminates. And so when you have all that stuff, um, you can remember particular incidents that you might not have unless you go, oh yeah, I remember on this German tour we played in Nuremberg. Oh yeah, and there was a funny thing about that day because blah 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 blah. So it was like a cool sense of nostalgia going through all that stuff when we were going, because basically the from 2008 until the book came out in 2014, the method was Dave would fly out from Chicago to Rochester, New York, here where I am for extended weekends and basically like interrogate me. And then we would also go through all the memorabilia I had. And that would in turn go, oh yeah, here's a cool story because I'm seeing this, or having a tour book that, I mean, I have a whole little metal museum in the lower floor of our house here with, the tour book when Exodus and Nuclear Assault toured, and still in good condition, where you got to turn the page. We always called it the Book of Lies, and that's what the Pop Seeger song Turn the Page is actually about, going, oh, where the fuck are we going now? And so that it did in turn bring back memories I hadn't thought about in years, and in turn was able to tell everybody else about it in the book. So that was great too, because I never would have remembered if it wasn't for, looking at this poster or laminate. So that's why, sorry.
No, fair enough. And I mean, that also poses a challenge, so to say, right? So to kind of turn it back into your direction, Dave, how do you kind of translate a lot of this, right? Because again, when I look at Dan's career, right, it crosses not just like bands, but also genres altogether. And there's so much happening. I mean, I think till the time the book was released, Dan was still active in quite a few bands, right? So
Yeah.
how do you kind of take all of that information and now kind of put it together in a book? Because if you look at it 10 years forward also, it still kind of stands really true as a documentation, right? So what was some of the challenges that kind of posed for you?
Well, I mean, initially when we started doing interviews, I just tried to go from the beginning, let's just go chronologically. That's kind of the only way, not the only way, you could go band by band, I guess, but that would also sort of be chronological. Um, and then, we kind of like got through everything, but, every time we would talk, there would be, oh, since the last time we talked, I remembered this about what you asked me about, or maybe whatever that, like, he would say something that I would make a note and be like, oh, we need to kind of go back to this later, and then like fill in some gaps. So, I just leaned on my kind of my like editing experience from my magazine days, where I just had these crazy transcriptions and would just kind of piece things together and then start interviewing other people, and you put their contributions in the appropriate place, and yeah, just try to make it all make sense. The I would say, to specifically answer your question, one of the challenges was later on in Danny's career, when there was maybe like Brutal Truth was his full-time band, but then there would be like a little nuclear assault activity, or SOD would do something. It was kind of like, okay, how do we keep the narrative, going, I guess, for lack of a better term, and not like confusing the reader where it's jumping around like crazy. So that was a bit difficult. There is kind of like a sly little thing that I don't think many people probably notice, but at the tops of the pages, it will kind of, there's like the main chapters for, Brutal Truth, SOD, Nuclear Assault, etc. Once it gets later in the book, like in the Hemlock section, when it kind of like bounces around between bands, the band name at the top of the page will change depending on like kind of what's being talked about in that section. That was just kind of like a fun little thing that we did to also just sort of maybe try to add a little clarity to, what was kind of on that page. And that was also part of the reason that I really wanted to include an index, is because there's like a lot mentioned in this book: people, songs, albums, you know, um, what a lot of nouns, and yeah, I am a librarian, and I thought it would be cool if someday somebody would go back and maybe use my book as something to build upon, their own work. So that was kind of another challenge. I had to redo that every time something changed, which was annoying, but I was here for it.
Yeah, and I think that also kind of works, right? Because what you said totally makes sense that even when I'm reading the book right now, it also serves like as a reference thing for whatever I'm kind of looking forward to. But just to go back to the book itself and kind of the writing process itself, one of the cool things is you also got in contributions from others who kind of played an important role in Dan's career. Uh,
Mhm.
what was that like again, getting information from a lot of them? Like now that you got stories from Dan, what was the interesting stories that you got from them? Any highlights, anything that still stands out all these years later?
Oh yeah. Well, for me as a fan, I would like to say for the record, I may not look like it, also a metal lifer, but so for me it was like very cool to get to talk to Dan, of course, but then all the other people, some of which I had like very tenuous connections with, like I'd interviewed Alex Webster before, so I was kind of like a bit of a known quantity, but I would say probably my favorite other people, Gene Hoglan told a great story about just like what a great stand-up guy that Dan is, which was also very flattering because he told me, before we kind of got going on the phone, he was like, I've told this story off the record to people over the years. And he was like, I'm very happy. Well, at that point, it was like, should this book ever come out? He was very happy to have it like kind of in print and like on the record, officially, which was very flattering. I was like, oh, I'm kind of being like, a uh what's the word I'm
Conduit.
looking for? Like I'm like, like a caretaker of this guy's story, and help bringing it to the masses, so to speak. So that was cool. I interviewed Dan's mom, and we republished a couple of her poems that she had published, which I thought was very good to tell like a well-rounded story of like his upbringing and the support that he had from her and his dad. And then let's see if I could think of the rule of threes. There were people that would come up that were, you have to have your Scott Ians in there. You have to have like John Connolly and like, the big bandmates, the Brutal Truth guys. But then, Dan brought up how, or maybe even I just like found it on Discogs or something, how he had produced the album for this weird grind band on Relapse called Monostat 7. And I loved Relapse and still do, but that was like a big label for me. And so I would have to go back and look, but I tracked down one of the guys from that band and interviewed him, which to him was very out of the ordinary. Not everyday people ringing him up trying to get the detailed story of the Monostat 7 recording. But I wanted to have people in there that were a little like left of center that you wouldn't expect. Maybe it just makes for a more well-rounded and engaging read, I thought.
Yeah, Mondstadt 7 was from Wyoming, and that is an interesting place.
Anything you want to add about that record that you remember, Dan?
Uh, well, let's see. Just for clarification, and it's slightly disgusting, but Monostat 7 was an American the was actually named after a medicine in America that women used when they got yeast infections. So that is the history. That's the behind the name. Uh, well, I was on the tour, Campaign for Musical Destruction, Napalm, Carcass, Cathedral, and Brutal Truth in '92. We played in Denver. Now, people are always handing you demos, and then you listen in the fucking van the next day and go, sounds like Cannibal Corpse, sounds like Morbid Angel or something, but then these guys from Monosat 7 gave us their tape, and it was just so odd and out there and interesting that I wrote them and said, that was really cool. And then they were like, wow, what do you think about producing our record? So they flew me out to Denver, Colorado, the state south of Wyoming. And if you go to Wyoming, you'll never come back. It's weird. And just produced their record. I did not ask for a big fee. I just said, cover my expenses, fly me out there, get me a hotel room. I don't want to pay for pizza, beer, or weed, and I'll do the record. And I did. So that's the story there. But yes, it's really cool that something out of left field like that is in the book. Because, I have dabbled with, experimented, played an Exit 13, kind of a lot of interesting stuff. So it's kind of cool that those kind of more obscure associations I had made it in there, rather than just, oh, he was an SOD, yawn. Everybody knows that, right? So
Yeah, which I'm also curious about because, like, again, I'm sure, Dave, when you were kind of going about, you must have had a long list. Was there someone that you kind of wanted to speak to that didn't end up doing, or maybe you attempted in the second edition to kind of include them?
Lano.
Yeah, that was the big one. Well, for the second edition, we didn't do any more interviews or anything. It was just we decided to kind of keep most of the guts of the book the same. But yeah, Billy Milano, I met him once selling merch for Brutal Truth here in Illinois. And I reached out to him, and I don't even know if I heard back from him, but I would have liked to have gotten, just his take on the SOD thing. That's like the one that jumps out. That's a good question. I would have to think harder about that, but I'll just say Billy Milano because it would have been nice to have him in there, especially because he's, not exactly the interview giving type. So I would have been pretty proud if I was able to get him. But oh well.
Well, then he lived up to his fucking reputation, didn't he?
Yeah, it's all right.
But anyone else that comes to mind to you, Dan, that you would have probably thought would have been part of something like this, but didn't end up?
I really can't, but that's also because Dave really did all the legwork. I just emailed a whole shitload of people and said, if you're interested in being in this book, please respond to this and get in touch with Dave. So he'd probably be more on point about knowing who would have turned it down or just as far as like anybody I might have like forgotten. It's kind of this thing where you have to draw a line somewhere. I mean,
Yeah.
so many fucking people I know that, could have had 500 more pages of just interviews with people in the metal scene and hardcore scene, but I don't know, everything had to be balanced a certain way. So I'm happy with it the way it is, I guess. That is my way of saying.
I did think of another one, which I haven't thought about this in a long time, but there is a bit in there where Danny talks about how I don't know if you mentioned Kerry King specifically, but how like Slayer heard the SOD record and then decided to, whatever. They wanted to like amp it up or whatever. There was like a connection there in terms of influence. And so I reached out to the publicist from Slayer and explained, it was kind of tough because again, we didn't have like a book deal or whatever. I was just some guy emailing people basically. But I emailed their publicist and said, hey, I'm working on this book. This is kind of the context. If I could just get like, whatever, 15 minutes on the phone with Kerry, I would love to talk to him about SOD. And their publicist, and I said, I would love to talk to him about SOD's influence on Slayer. And their publicist wrote me back and said, I don't think Kerry would want to talk about the influence of System of a Down on Slayer. And I said,
I never fucking heard that. Are you kidding me?
I'm not kidding you. Sorry. That is a true story. And I just didn't even bother to reply. I was like, never mind. It's fine.
Yeah, I think it's time to fire your publicist.
Yeah. But that is a true story. I
That's
will
hilarious.
look and see if I still have that email for you, Dan.
That's great.
Yeah.
Never mind. Should have fucking asked. Yeah.
I love how this has come up in an interview like so many years later, but it's
especially because I had never heard that story. So
yeah, there you go.
Great. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm also, which also brings me back, and let's go back to the start, right? Is there's a second edition of Perpetual Conversion that's out right now. Why do another edition like all these years later? What kind of prompted that, and how's the response been now that you've seen that the book is out again? Both of whoever wants to go first, Dave or Dan.
I mean, I guess I'll answer that because I'm the one shipping them all from my apartment in Chicago, but people have been into it. The kind of question for the last 5 or 6 years was like, what is the demand for this? It's kind of like impossible to gauge without doing some sort of like intense heavy metal market research or something, which is not what we were going to do. But people, Dan can speak to this. People would approach him and ask about it. Every once in a while, I would get an email through my website saying, "Hey, like I missed the boat on this. Like, do you have a copy?" And I didn't. And yeah, so we knew, and then just like if you consider the amount of metal fans out there, and like you were saying, there's like people that were probably younger 10 years ago that might be interested now that, just to pull numbers out of my ass, like maybe somebody was 17 and now they're 27 and are like a little more aware and they didn't know then, so we just said, okay, let's just press or print up 500 of these and, considering the worldwide amount of metalheads, we thought that was a pretty safe number and so far so good, We still have some, but it's like people have been pretty excited about it. I'm happy just to have it back out there again, really.
Yeah, and we should mention that the new edition, it's new about it is it has a forward from Thomas Lindbergh from Out the Gates, and it's got a new color picture section, which actually has some pretty recent stuff that I got up to earlier this year. So, although there isn't more text in it, but it's still, had that stuff to differentiate it from the first edition, as meager as those differences are. And yeah, like he said, also just because it had been unavailable for 5 years, and when people would say to me, "Hey, dude, how do I get a copy of your book?" And I'd have to shrug at them. So we said, okay, something must be done. So that's also another reason,
Yeah.
availability.
Okay, so I know earlier this year, I think in October, you all did an event, and there was a Q&A with the meet and greet and signing and all of that. Do you all have any more events like that planned? I mean, this is primarily for those in the States who are tuned into this, right? Is there anything else kind of planned around promotion of the book?
No, not really. I mean, this is actually, I should mention that we're doing a whole round of interviews like the one we're doing with you. This is actually the most we've done to promote this book ever, where Dave had the idea to call up an old friend of mine from the music industry, who you would know as Liz from Earsplit, and say, hey, maybe we should publicize the book a little bit. So there's that. And the Generation Records thing was because, an old dear friend of mine, Drew Stone, who does the New York Hardcore Chronicles, helped set that up. And so no, there's really nobody besides me and Dave doing this. There's no permanent publicist who's like, all right, guys, now we're going to go to Chicago and do this, but or anything like that. Although he would already be there because that's what Dave. So I had to pick that town, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but no, that doesn't mean that if somebody wouldn't express interest in it and if it was feasible, then we certainly would be into entertaining the notion, but we are not planning anything from our end, no.
Okay, and I have to give a shout out to Liz because like it was great when I saw the email from her and she was like, Dan Lilker available for interviews. And I was like, what? So it's obviously one of those things where you kind of click through the email, right? It's like, what's happening? What's happening? Right? Is there an announcement that I'm getting an exclusive to or something like that? Uh, but okay, I mean, I have to kind of wrap up, but there's something I wanted to ask you ever since you kind of mentioned when you realized I'm from India. Uh, Tell me about like how your discovery still is of music Dan. I mean, like the fact that you actually knew specific bands and you can kind of give them shout outs also, since you kind of said you were wearing one of their t-shirts yesterday.
Oh, well, I was just going down a rabbit hole on the internet one night when I couldn't sleep and I was smoking weed and I was looking for blasphemy interviews. So obviously the first band that has, the war metal or whatever, you started reading about Titan Blood from Spain, and then Tetragrammaton came up. So then I couldn't find them on Spotify, which is very cult. But
Yeah. Not
um,
surprised at all.
yeah, I found the Primal Incinerators of whatever the fuck record on YouTube, and I was like, wow, this is the speed of the first Brutal Truth record with the bomb blast, but these songs are 7 minutes long. So that was very impressive. So yeah, I said, holy shit, and then turned them, I played them for Ross from Immolation. He was equally shocked. And then a friend of mine from Germany who's into all that stuff, who takes pictures with gas masks and stuff like that. I turned him on to that, and then he in turn sent me one of their shirts that he ordered from Iron Bonehead because it's a German label. So I was just very shocked by their intensity. So I do enjoy some Tetragrammaton. I've heard Gutslit. They're a little more of the traditional kind of Cannibal Corpse-esque, fast and brutal thing. But Tetragrammaton I like just because it was super fast and it just sounded kind of wrong. And that's a good thing. It's something just you can tell that the people who are making it are just not right in the head. Plus all their song titles, all that fucking stuff that I assume is kind of like that Aleister Crowley, H.P. Lovecraft type of, and ironic, because they're using English as a second language and they're using these 8 syllable words that we can't even say. So yeah, you tell Marshall Opium I said hi if you can.
Yeah, I will. I mean, the funny part is these guys are so cult they won't even do interviews with me.
Oh, well then whatever.
Yeah,
Tell him I said hi.
yeah. But do you actually get time now to check any current acts, any bands that you're currently like fascinated by?
Nothing I could speak of as of late, except that very recently in the last week, I've had a good reason not to want to look at the news anymore as an American,
Yeah, yeah.
which is all I'm going to say. So I went into another rabbit hole and I am now exploring Icelandic black metal.
Okay. Interesting.
It's very strange. I think those people eat a lot of shrooms or something, because all the bands I have heard, which are Wormlust is easy to pronounce, but then there's another band that was like um and yeah, I don't know, maybe it's the isolation, but these guys do very tripped out stuff, and I don't know what they're on. I have no problem with that, but yeah, that's just a little rabbit hole I'm currently in.
Awesome. You know what? I'm definitely going to try figuring out doing a separate chat with you because I think we can do this for like hours, but we're definitely going to catch up on a better time. But
Sure.
thank you so much, Dan, Dave, for taking time out to speak to me. Really appreciate it. And
Mhm.
yeah, final words for everyone who's kind of listening to this so far.
I guess for me, it's the usual take the time to express my appreciation and gratitude to people out there in the metal scene supporting extreme metal. Not just what I've done particularly, but the whole spirit of it, because there would be no reason for a book about me if nobody gave a shit, right? So, um, just thank you to everybody who's been keeping this scene, that just metal in general, going all this time. You've proved that it's a legitimate genre, which will go in the history books. And I couldn't have done everything I've done if nobody cared. Put it that way. So thanks, Dave.
Um, I don't know. Thank you to you, Peter, anybody listening. And then I feel like my role at this point is always just to be the cheap plug guy where I just say, if you want to order the book, just it's the title, perpetualconversion.com.
One
And that will
word.
take you to a page where you can order one, and I will dutifully ship it to you and hope it makes it there in one piece.
Yep,
Yeah.
even all the way to India.
Done. I'll definitely add the link in the show notes itself. Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, dude.
And that was Dan Lilker and Dave Hofer. Really enjoyed my chat with them. Do check out the book if you haven't already. Before I sign off, as always, do leave me a rating on whichever podcast platform you're listening to this episode on, or do hit subscribe and maybe share this episode with a friend if they're into metal. If you are a label or a band and want to get in touch, you can hit me up, trendcrusher@gmail.com, or hit me up on social media. Just search for me. I'm Trendcrusher on Instagram. That's all for this episode. I'll see you all very soon. Cheers.